I'm Terry Gerton. I'm president of the National Academy of Public Administration, and I would like to welcome you to a discussion about how we can generate the workforce we'll need to support the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. This event is a convening of the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships at the Academy, which we formed in September of 2021 in recognition that effective problem solving in the public sphere requires federal, state, and local governments to work together, often with their private and nonprofit sector partners. We've got a terrific program lined up for you this afternoon. And first, I'd like to introduce two members of the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships Executive Board. Henry Cisneros is an Academy Fellow and the chairman and co-founder of American III, an infrastructure investment firm in New York. Henry was elected the first Hispanic American mayor of a major U.S. city in San Antonio, Texas in 1981. He served as the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development during the Clinton administration. He's also held leadership positions with Univision, the National League of Cities, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and Habitat for Humanity International. And Sarah Wartell is also an Academy Fellow. She's been the president of Urban Institute since 2012. This nonprofit research organization provides data and evidence to help improve the well-being of families and communities. And previously, Sarah was the founding chief operating officer and then executive vice president of the Center for American Progress. She also served on the National Economic Council, held advising and consulting roles at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and practiced law with the Washington, D.C. firm Arnold and Porter. So thank you both for being here this afternoon. And I want to take a moment to talk about the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships. You both agreed to make time in your very busy schedules to serve on the executive board for the center. And so, Sarah, why do you think it's so important that we talk about the intergovernmental system?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us, and thank you for taking on this really important topic. It is the case that every big, important problem that we face as a society requires a degree of complexity and coordination that is often at the root of our inability to make forward progress. And the topic you're going to talk about today, infrastructure and workforce issues, the intersection between the two, is a perfect example of this. I was on a call yesterday with a Fortune 100 CEO, and we were talking about their sort of their agenda to the federal government in the area of workforce. And the words that we used over and over again were bespoke, complex. How do we get to simple? So for someone who's trying to work with the public sector to solve a big societal problem, develop enough workforce to meet the needs of society, the complexity of different layers that they have to navigate is so hard. And unless we can get the different layers of government to find mechanisms, approaches, models for coordinating across these different silos, it's too hard for our partners to work with us. So I really think this idea of trying to get to ways to approach problems from multiple layers together at one time is critical to being successful for our big challenges.
Laid out a really important challenge. And Henry, I want to go to you. You've served at the federal level, you've served at the local level. To Sarah's point, why is it so hard to navigate our intergovernmental system?
Well, I think it's difficult because government is composed of people, and it's hard to organize people and keep them informed and communicate well. It's appropriate that NAPA, under your leadership, Terry, would take on this subject of workforce related to infrastructure, and particularly the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is passed as it did bipartisanly because it's recognized as so important. So the needs are so great for infrastructure modernization, and it has high expectations. Now, for those expectations to be met, we're going to have to address directly the workforce kinds of questions that are being raised in this conference today. They're important because these jobs cannot be done without extensive coordination in the workforce area. We see right now the effects on the supply chain of breakdowns in our workforce shortage and workforce shortages. And we can't afford to have that as we get this infrastructure effort underway. The economic impact, which was one of the selling points of this infrastructure package, is another reason why we'll have to reach people with good jobs, train people who are presently not trained to have the economic impact be as extensive as it can. And finally, another selling point for this was the equity dimensions, to reach into different populations in our cities and such. And to do that will require extensive coordination. So the importance of the intergovernmental system working together to prove that government can do these creative and difficult things is very key, and it's upon us in this infrastructure effort.
I think we're going to have a lot of conversation about the workforce topic, particularly today, and I'm really looking forward to that. But before we get to it, I do want to ask you both, we stood up this center with your support on the executive board. And so from your seat now, how can the center really help energize this conversation? And what do you hope that it accomplishes? Let me go to Sarah first.
Sure. I used this word before and I want to come back to it. It's models. Each time we have a new grand challenge, whether it was responding to the pandemic and the public health system, whether it was distributing emergency assistance around the housing market we had during the pandemic, building our workforce or delivering infrastructure, each of these challenges has what I almost call like brain-numbing complexity that people have to work through. And we often work it through, and by the time we figure out how to make everybody work together and everybody aligned, you're kind of coming out of something. And then when the next big challenge comes, we start all over again. And so it feels to me like we need some approaches. And an idea I have as a model in my mind was the way in which the Obama administration approached using evidence, the sort of I3 grants, the idea of using evidence as a approach. And then they applied that approach in a whole variety of different sectors. So you use them evidence-based and you reward it with additional funding. What are those mechanisms in the intergovernmental space that you can return to time and time again that are understood so that we don't have to invent the model around each set of problems? That's my hope, that the center will find some good solutions that we can reference and understand.
Thank you for that. And Henry, what's your perspective on how the center can be instrumental in helping to address these crucial problems?
Terry, NAPA has always been an important contributor to innovation and forward progress in the intergovernmental sphere. And now it's needed more than ever. We're living through a very difficult time in our country with a lot of contention, a lot of division. There's people writing books about the potential for civil war. That's how unhappy people are out across the country. And I suspect one of the dimensions of that unhappiness is people's dissatisfaction with the results from governmental programs. And we're at a time where we have to really make an effort to make our government work. If people are going to pay taxes and be stressed and put faith in government, et cetera, then they want to see results. And a lot of it revolves around these questions of whether or not we can communicate, whether we can be effective, whether we can share roles. I come from a background where I know there's a lot of innovation and capacity at the local level. And I see it across the country. A lot of young people today want to make a difference. They don't think they need to go to Washington to make a difference. They can make it in their local government, their school board, et cetera. But only if the federal government understands a sense of partnership and shares a different role. Maybe some of the revenues come from the federal government, but a lot of latitude to have innovation at the local level. We have now the benefit of new technologies that make it possible to communicate as never before. We need to deploy those in the interests of cooperation across the intergovernmental system. And I do believe NAPA, that has always played that kind of foresighted role, can play it in this instance, and frankly, must. We're running out of time, and people are running out of patience with government as we know it.
You both have laid out some pretty significant challenges for the center, and I just want to express again my appreciation for you being willing to dedicate your expertise and your time to make sure that we do turn the center into something that is going to have an impact. Because as you say, and as NAPA has said in some of its other reports, the time to do this is now, and the urgency of the problems in front of us are so important. So thank you both for helping us to set the stage for the center's ongoing work and today's discussion.
Thank you, Terry.
Speaking of today's discussion, let me start with some background. On November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This investment in America's infrastructure will provide $973 billion over 5 years and includes $550 billion in new investment. The IIJA holds the potential to create millions of jobs and to create new opportunities for people who've been sidelined and who've been unable to connect to meaningful work. Its funding will generate new jobs in industries critical to keep the nation's public works systems running. However, unprecedented labor shortage across the United States, and so finding and preparing people for these new jobs may be challenging. Today's discussion ties in with one of the Academy's grand challenges, connecting individuals to meaningful work. From an intergovernmental standpoint, we're going to talk about the complexity of the workforce system and how organizations at many different levels must come to the table to develop integrated and effective strategies. So I'd like to now introduce Ed Mortimer of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to provide our opening remarks about the workforce issues related to the IIJA and how the Chamber is responding. Ed is the Vice President for Transportation and Infrastructure at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ed?
Terry, thank you very much for that introduction and appreciate everything the Academy and specifically the Center is doing. This is such a timely discussion. So many of these intergovernmental sources were part of the stakeholder effort over the last 10 years to get this legislation enacted into law. And from our perspective at the Chamber, this is a once in a generational opportunity to think anew, to bring private sector innovation and technology to modernize our nation's infrastructure. And so, all the work that went into getting the legislation through, and I thought, Henry, you did a great job of talking about the bipartisan nature of it. We in the business community have always looked at infrastructure as there's an old saying, there is no Republican road or Democrat bridge. These are American assets. And with enactment of this law, to match with what's going on at the state and local level, we have an opportunity to move ourselves from a brick and mortar economy to an e-commerce environment. We know that young millennials are looking for many multimodal choices. And so making sure that we have an integrated infrastructure network is something that truly only the federal government can bring to bear. And again, it's a shared partnership, and we have several of those partners that are going to be in the panel discussion, and I look forward to hearing from them. But again, all the work that went into this, and we all know what infrastructure means. It means improved quality of life. We at the Chamber view infrastructure as kind of a circulatory system of economic growth. And it also provides that quality of life for communities to grow, to thrive, and to attract new people to their area. And so that's why the Chamber put so much weight into getting this infrastructure bill done. It was not the prettiest of process, but because of the work that many of the folks on this meeting and others did, we were able to get it enacted in the law into the year. But our job is not done. And that's why this discussion today is so timely. You all know that even before the pandemic, in the construction space, we were having some workforce shortages. The Chamber's commercial construction index shows that we have about 50,000 open construction jobs currently. Studies show from Georgetown University and S&P that with enactment of this bipartisan infrastructure bill, we're looking to add at least 1 million to 1.5 million jobs over the next decade. And the question is, where are we going to find them? I'd like to lay out some things that the Chamber's looking at, and I know our discussion we're going to have later is going to get into much more detail in some of these areas. But again, it's a multi-pronged approach, and I thought both Sarah and Henry kind of laid out some really good points that it's everyone working together. We all have our own perspectives, but we need to put the nation first. This is a once in a generational opportunity. If we don't make this right, if we don't make the right investments to ensure that these investments last for 50 to 75 years to come, we're not going to get this kind of opportunity for the next 25 or 30 years. So again, making sure that all levels of government with business community, the other members of the stakeholder community are working together to ensure that we like to call them at the chamber shovel worthy. These projects that are truly going to make their communities, our country, a better place to grow economy wise and from a quality of life. So from the chamber's perspective, we have a couple of initiatives that are going on right now to add to this discussion. Number one, as I mentioned, we knew we had a workforce challenge even before the pandemic. We certainly are having one now. So the Chamber's launched an America Works initiative to really highlight the opportunities that are available. Let's go reach out to communities who have not been part of these opportunities. As we all know, jobs in the infrastructure space are high paying and they don't require a 4-year education. So, Henry talked earlier about equity. Equity doesn't just mean those communities benefit from the infrastructure, but they should be part of the design, the construction, the maintenance of this brand new infrastructure. And so our initiative is really going out to those communities who may not have heard about these opportunities. I get to talk to small business owners around the country, and so many of them say they want to be part of this effort, but they don't know where the jobs are. They don't know where the skills are. So business wants to work with all government entities to ensure we reach out to those communities and provide those job skills. We also have an equality of opportunity initiative where, again, underserved communities and a lot of communities where investments were made in infrastructure that truly disadvantaged the community from economic growth. The bipartisan infrastructure bill enacted into law provides opportunities to think anew, to tear down old infrastructure that divided communities, and to rebuild to ensure that every American, no matter where you live, whether you're rural or urban, have connections throughout our country and can move in a safe and efficient manner. So again, our ability to work with our folks at the federal, state, and local level to get to those communities. We even work with organized labor in looking at apprenticeship programs. They have some of the best. We'd like to work with them where it makes sense and grow them where we can. There is no one easy solution to this discussion. I'm sure our panel will pull that out today, that there is no 1, 2, or 3. It's going to be a combination of all the above. But again, this is such a critical initiative for our nation to take place in spite of all the partisanship that's going on right now. This is something that brought Republicans and Democrats together. As our country is getting out of a pandemic, this is really the time to make these long-term investments that, again, provide that long-term economic growth that our country will benefit for many years to come. So, we at the Chamber also understand that we got to grow the workforce. We'd love to have a discussion about immigration policy. That's a tough issue right now, but we're not backing away from continuing to push that at the federal level. We need to find a way to bring in men and women into this country legally to add to the workforce. Again, if you get the theme throughout my comments here, it's all of the above. There is no 1, 2, or 3. It's an all of the above approach to make sure we get the men and women to build our infrastructure. And again, as I mentioned earlier, these are really interesting jobs. These are good paying jobs. They don't require a 4-year degree. So we have the ability to go to some communities that may have not have had these opportunities. So many of our small business owners want to be part of this, large businesses, small businesses, but they need to know where the opportunities are. And so, I'll give the administration credit. They set up an infrastructure program with Mitch Landrieu, former mayor of New Orleans, who is going to be the lead for the administration to coordinate all of their activities. We're going to hear from the Department of Labor in the panel to hear about their efforts. But again, the coordination that's going on at the federal level, unprecedented. But we all need to understand this is a long-term play. Some people may try to confuse some of this infrastructure investment with what happened in 2009, where there was a Recovery Act that put a bunch of money in infrastructure. And the term they used back then was shovel ready. Well, what shovel ready meant was let's hurry up and get some people some jobs and let's fix some curbs and potholes. This, again, is a much more longer term. This is about fixing the 45,000 structurally deficient bridges in our country. This is about getting the lead out of the pipes that happens in about 70% of water mains in this country. Again, we're very excited that this is a broad infrastructure bill, not just our transportation networks, but also rural broadband to make sure every citizen has broadband access. As we get into the 21st century, if you're going to have a job, you can't just get broadband at school or at Starbucks. You need to be able to get it wherever you live and wherever you work. And making sure that the private sector can help deliver that is going to be really critical as part of this infrastructure bill. So again, this is a once in a generational opportunity to really modernize America's infrastructure, which was the envy of the world, but now it's reached its useful conclusion and we need to think anew. And I can speak for the chamber and the private sector. We're ready, willing, and able to join our colleagues at all levels of government to ensure this is done right, it's done timely, but at the same point, we can address so many of our societal problems. We can make sure that equity is dealt with. We can make sure we address climate and we build infrastructure that is resilient to handle changing environmental conditions. It's no longer who's at fault. We just know that we have this once in a generational investment. Let's make those investments to make sure that this infrastructure can handle the climate conditions of today and the future. And again, as we bring on autonomous vehicles, drones, let's make sure we build to the future. Bring in electric charging stations, looking at hydrogen. Let's make sure we build an infrastructure that allows us to continue to grow into the future. So again, I really appreciate the Academy and particularly the Center for having this important discussion. Appreciate the opportunity for the U.S. Chamber to be part of it. We want to be a critical partner with you and get this done right so America thrives and our nation can be successful. So Terry, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks. You really reminded us of how broad the scope of infrastructure is and how important not just the intergovernmental space, but how all of the government agencies partner with their private sector partners and regional solutions, with their nonprofit partners, and how important it is to get the whole system together to address the issue that Sarah raised at the beginning, which is, can we make this simpler? Can we help people navigate through? So you've really teed up our panel discussion, and I'm so grateful that you were able to join us today. Thank you. Turn it over to Tom Shoop, who is going to lead our panel discussion amongst a group of experts who really are going to be able to share with us about the intergovernmental workforce aspects of the IIJA. Tom is an Academy Fellow, and he is the editor-at-large of GovExec. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Terry. And when Terry says I'm going to lead the discussion, I interpret that as being, I'm going to try to stay out of the way as much as possible of our terrific panelists we have today, who are really the experts in this area and have great thoughts to share. I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves briefly and maybe say a little bit about why infrastructure and workforce development is important to them and their organization. Let's start with Matt Chase, CEO and Executive Director of the National Association of Counties.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And thank you to the National Academy of Public Administration. I want to give a shout out to Terry and her great team, as well as the board of directors at NAPA for creating this center. For the National Association of Counties, we represent 3,069 county governments. Our members invest about $660 billion a year in our local communities. And as far as workforce, counties employ 3.6 million Americans, so more than 1% of all Americans work for county government. As it ties to infrastructure, we're one of the largest owners of public infrastructure. And I think Ed Mortimer did a great job of outlining the definition of infrastructure. But from a county perspective, we own 1,000 hospitals, about 800 nursing homes, thousands of jails, courthouses, libraries, community facilities, all sorts of community assets. When people think of infrastructure, I think they go to transportation infrastructure. We're also a huge stakeholder in transportation. America's counties own about 45% of all the road miles, about 40% of all the bridges, about a third of the airports, and we invest in about 70% of transit systems. So within traditional transportation, we're a huge owner and operator or funder. We also play a huge role in water, sewer, and stormwater. And I don't think we can forget about stormwater, particularly as it comes to flood control and disaster preparedness, as well as environmental stewardship. So we have a huge role to play in infrastructure and workforce. I really look forward to this panel. And I want to just really quickly state the importance of the intergovernmental system and define it for people as simply the balance, division, and sharing, the keyword sharing of power and responsibilities between different levels of government, federal, state, local, and tribal. And I think a lot of folks don't really comprehend what intergovernmental is, but it is that balance, division, and sharing of powers and responsibilities. So Tom, thanks again.
Great. Let's go to Susan Fallon, Senior Vice President of Monster Government Solutions.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Tom. Terry, thank you and the outstanding team at NAPA for pulling this great panel, this great afternoon together. So at Monster, our vision is to make every workplace happier and more productive. And we do that by transforming the way employers and job seekers or candidates find the right fit. So I lead Monster Government Solutions, and we build workforce development and talent acquisition software exclusively for the federal, state, and local market to solve their biggest employment challenges. So one of the reasons why we are so excited to be here today, jobs is what we do, it is our DNA, but importantly, as part of this intergovernmental conversation, which also brings to bear the power of private-public partnerships, is because we are in this collectively. And, we know that the job market is cyclical, and we're seeing right now that we're going through a rebound and we're doing a recovery. We see as this begins to take shape that the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is going to play a major role in accelerating that. And Monster is looking forward to play a major role in connecting employers and job seekers in this fit as we build back.
Great. Next up is John V. Ladd, Administrator of the Office of Apprenticeship in the Employment and Training Administration at the U.S. Department of Labor. John?
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I am John Ladd. I'm the administrator here at the Office of Apprenticeship, which is part of the Employment and Training Administration at the U.S. Department of Labor. So ETA broadly has a number of workforce development programs under its purview that are key to funding efforts across states and localities around workforce development and preparation. As the administrator for the Office of Apprenticeship, I head up the national apprenticeship system, and the infrastructure bill really represents a historic opportunity. It was mentioned before, but these are programs that have historically provided great jobs, great careers, well-paying careers, career ladders for folks, but there hasn't always been the kind of equity across these programs that we would like to see in terms of access for women and people of color and other underrepresented populations. So we are so excited about the opportunity to really address these historic inequities across a lot of the traditional apprenticeship programs, which, when you think about it, this funding will likely lead to a major expansion of traditional apprenticeship programs in the construction, manufacturing industry, but also in transportation. We talked about clean water, just a range of industries where you can find apprenticeship programs today. And we want to make sure that those programs and the industries are really looking at this as an historic opportunity to address some of those inequities, but also to help support the workforce that's going to be needed to support these projects. So we're incredibly excited, but we know there's a big challenge out there to make sure the system is ready to implement these efforts across the country. So thank you for having me today.
Great. And last, but by no means least, is someone who's on the ground dealing with these issues day in, day out. That's Marty Leathers, Director of the Office of Workforce Development for the state of Missouri. Marty?
Well, thank you, Tom. It's great to be a part of this panel with such esteemed colleagues. I'm excited today. I am the Director of Workforce Development in the state of Missouri, and I was appointed by our governor in 2017. However, Matt, I was also a county clerk at one time about a decade ago, so I know about trying to maintain those roads and those bridges and that public works, in addition to having staff to do it. In Missouri, from day one, our governor has supported the idea of infrastructure and workforce development. And we like to say that was before it was cool. And really, we like to define infrastructure really as a point of access and connectivity, right? It doesn't matter what modality of infrastructure we're talking about, whether it's roads, bridges, tunnels, or broadband, but it's about how do we increase access for all of our citizens, right? For all populations, regardless of their situation or where they are. And then how do we help those individuals connect to the broader economy in our perspective, but also into global citizenship and to other resources. We think the bipartisan infrastructure plan plays a big, big role. Missouri is going to get about $6 billion out of this, in addition to what we might be able to competitively procure. That's going to make a big difference. Our governor also created the Supply Chain Management Task Force, of which I co-chair along with my colleague, the director of the Missouri Department of Transportation. Again, a full commitment to workforce development and infrastructure so that we can ensure that we are aligned to look at some of these issues. One of the things that and I love John talking about apprenticeships, we're real proud of apprenticeships in Missouri, and we'll talk about that later. We do have a rich tradition in, being one of the national leaders in apprenticeship expansion and modernization. But for us, we understand you can't build anything without people, and so, back to, Henry's comment about government as a collection of people, as a political scientist, I know there's some bounded rationality there about behaviors, but I also know that it's the people who will drive that there's the people who drive all parts of the organization. And so you cannot have an infrastructure bill or plan or funding without having the people to do it. While there's not the dollars there that we know that we need, we understand that now we have the opportunities. And so we have to work together to connect and be able to do that. So states are looking at that. I think states and counties and cities are going to have to figure out, where the workforce is. And that's what we're here to try to do, because yes, we can have the most modern infrastructure out there, but if we don't have the people to build it and the people to operate it, then we really won't get very far.
Great, thanks. Thanks to all the panelists. I'd like to start us off with you, Matt. Give us the lay of the land from the county perspective. You mentioned just how many people work for county governments. What's the situation at the county level in terms of workforce development?
Yeah, it's very complex, obviously. So with COVID, during the COVID period, local governments, so including K through 12 cities and counties and other municipalities, we're still down about 608,000 jobs from our pre-pandemic level. So we're down over 500,000 jobs. What we have seen is early retirements, and we've seen resignations. From a county perspective, we've seen most of our resignations in our public health staff, obviously. Why would you want to stay in public health if you're dealing with death threats every day? Our election staff have faced a lot of challenges. And then when we get into things like public works, we've seen some challenges there as well. What we're seeing is county leadership really trying to adjust, where counties were the old kind of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. You come to the county courthouse or you come to your county building and you work in the office. And in some caseworkers are out in the field. But what we're really seeing is counties having to move very quickly to being more flexible, similar to the private sector or other sectors, in how you let people work. We've had a lot of challenges filling positions. I think that's across all industries, but we are definitely seeing challenges replacing our lost workforce and ramping up. And I think one of the things that I just want to highlight is that we're down 600,000 jobs at the local level at a time when, on the other side of our ledger, if you will, our casework, our responsibilities have increased tenfold. And so here we are trying to deal with a pandemic. We're trying to deal with these once-in-a-generation opportunities with American Rescue Plan and now the infrastructure plan. And so we actually need to grow our workforce, not just get back to where we were.
Great. Susan, I wanted to turn to you to talk about what some of the data has to say about the state of affairs. Matt mentioned, the impact of resignations and the difficulty in filling jobs. Monster sits on top of a lot of data and does a lot of analysis of this. What does it tell you about the current state of affairs?
Sure. Well, there are challenges. And just for reference, every year, Monster does sit on top of a lot of data, but we also go out and we survey job seekers, job candidates, and employers across the country. And we just recently completed and published our annual Future of Work survey, where I'm going to today draw from some of those stats that we pulled through. And the reason we do this is to uncover not just trends, but also worker and employer sentiment, as well as opportunities that we see in the market. And I think specifically with the lay of the land, if we look historically, every January, there's an uptick in job search activity. And this has not been any different this year. As a matter of fact, it's up. And what's interesting, when we narrow down on infrastructure related job searches, we've already seen an increase of over 25% in such jobs than we did even over the previous 5 months. And those would be in construction, project managers, truck drivers, for example.
Great. John, I wanted to turn to you. So you head up the apprenticeship program at the Labor Department. Tell us more about its role in workforce preparation and how you work with states and localities. You mentioned the importance of intergovernmental, and how does that play out?
Sure. Again, our office sits within ETA, which, ETA's mission broadly is really around workforce preparation, and we oversee a range of workforce development programs from WIOA, trade adjustment assistance, Job Corps, apprenticeship, and others. And those are important programs and important resources at the state and local level that we really hope states and localities are leveraging to support implementation of IIJA. But my office specifically, we work very closely with states, maybe less so with localities. In most cases, again, ETA funds states and localities and other entities to actually operate workforce programs. And in the case of apprenticeship, that is the case in about half of the states where they've established a federally recognized state apprenticeship agency. So about half of those states have their own state apprenticeship infrastructure. But in the other half of the states, there is no state apprenticeship agency. And so my office provides that role. We have state and federal field offices across the country, and we provide a whole range of services from providing outreach to employers and industry, the registration process, technical assistance, oversight. But really, regardless of whether, what the actual governance is, we work really closely. We see the states as our partners in this effort. And I'll talk a little bit more later as we talk about funding, about ideas we have around connecting at the local level. But ultimately, there really needs to be that federal state partnership to really focus on not just establishing, but expanding registered apprenticeship programs as a workforce solution. So we've got great partnerships across the country, and we're looking to expand on them.
That sounds exciting, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in a little bit. Marty, I wanted to turn to you. You said you have been preparing for infrastructure workforce development since before it was cool. I guess that means it's cool now. Tell us more about that, about how long you've been at this and what you've learned so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2018, early 2018, we looked at, across the state, and we realized a few things were happening. And I'll get to the punchline of infrastructure in a second, but we looked primarily at economic development, workforce development, and higher education or post-secondary education. So anything after high school, including training, apprenticeships, et cetera. And the idea was we were wholly siloed. We were not working together. And we frankly had low labor force participation rates and it had declined for, almost a decade and a half. We had, the ninth highest high school graduation rates in the country, but then we were 48 out of 50 when it came to how many, what our college graduation rates were. So we realized there was a broken model, right? And then we, had challenges with some of our economic development functions. So we laid out this framework to say, listen, we got to focus on infrastructure because that is, a big piece of economic development, but it also, as I said earlier, it kind of works across the spectrum. And then we got to understand what's going on with, education, certainly K-12, but primarily for us, the post-secondary side of education. And in that, we include workforce training, any of the federally public workforce programs that I oversee through ETA, like John mentioned, as well as apprenticeships, but also, what are we sending people to school for, right? And what is happening once they receive these degrees? So it came out with a formula and this policy framework of, it doesn't matter if it's infrastructure policy or infrastructure investments, or if it's workforce or if it's education. Policy is about making choices, right? And it's all about opportunity cost. We understood that everything had to line out to two things. How are we helping our citizens access work and stay in work? Because that was really the core purpose, if you will, of having that highway system so that we can have commerce move, which means having people move, right? So they can go do the jobs that they need to do. We had to have education, make sure that we're training those individuals to invest in individuals so they can, be more productive and support our economic growth. And then workforce development, how we're aligning all these resources together. So we laid out a pretty broad policy framework that really kind of looked across, 4 areas. The first one is, and you're going to kind of laugh when you hear this because it's a very much of a dumb moment, but it was about, how we ensure everything we're doing comes back to increasing, access to quality employment opportunities and sustainable employment opportunities. And so, means family sustaining wages. It means, on a pathway to self-sustainability. The second piece of it is how do we ensure employers actually are articulating and getting the needs they need, right? There's certainly a translation barrier between education and employers and even now the public of what the needs are. And we're seeing those needs shift even as the power kind of converts over to supporting workers. The other side is aligning workforce and education to actually meet what employers and citizens need. And then finally, infrastructure. What infrastructure investments, whether it's broadband, whether it's our bridges and intermodal facilities, et cetera, to make sure we're doing that. So we kind of look at everything through that lens. And so we started making necessary investments. For instance, we expanded, we said apprenticeships are a big goal for us because not only do we want educational attainment, through our post-secondary institutions, we also want to see a higher enrollment rate and a higher completion rate of apprentices. So more apprentices means more people working, right? More skilled talent in the skilled trades or in some of these other sectors means that we can do more with infrastructure. So we connected those things together and said, we got to think about these more holistically. So, for us, it became fun. We did the, quick plug. We have a website called bestinmidwest.com, the word best, the word in, the word midwest.com. You can follow this whole journey. But really, we revolutionized, and what I like to say is we redesigned kind of the agency structure around, how we conduct, economic growth. And then now we're in a better position to make investments and to build out these things, whether it was, coming into the pandemic and with the CARES Act or with ARPA and now the bipartisan infrastructure plan. We're in a better position now because we know what we need to do, or we know how to find out what we need to do instead of just trying to think, being at ground zero.
Great. Susan, I wanted to go back to you and ask, what kind of trends are you seeing, and are you seeing trends already related to IIJA and infrastructure related applicants, hiring, job openings? What are you seeing?
Sure. I think, Tom, we're seeing some, but really it's just this, the funds are just starting to make their way out to the states. There hasn't really been a significant intake. I think we have not seen a significant increase yet in infrastructure jobs, but that said, there are a tremendous number of these jobs open today. So I think this challenge that we've been talking about, for the last half hour or so on, our workforce needs. Right now, there are definitely more jobs than we have workers, and the interesting trends that we're seeing now around seekers as they start to look for and explore these types of jobs are also the searches around the skills. So what when we're working with job seekers in many ways in this market, right, the savvy job seeker is going to lead with their skills, but also with those transferable skills. their aptitude to learn, their communication skills, their flexibility, their leadership attributes, those things that make them as successful in the position as those trained skills. And then we're also seeing the savvy employers who are trying to compete and win for talent begin to use job boards, for example, Monster, to search not just on job titles, but on skills that they can leverage today. And then it can also bring these workers in and begin to upskill them as well.
You mentioned that there's more jobs than people available for them right now. Is that true across the country, or is it worse in some places than others?
Sure. I think it's really across the board. We're seeing this challenge pretty much in every job market, in all sectors, across all geographies, which then comes back again to the competition and how employers, they're competing against each other for these opportunities. And so that's one of the interesting things that we've seen, not just in the market, but really post-pandemic, where employers are having to compete for talent, increasing wages, offering more flexible time, offering additional benefits. We're seeing an influx of signing bonuses, relocation bonuses for jobs at many different, wage grades and skill than we've seen in the past recent time period. So what's interesting is these strategies for attracting and retaining the talent is going to be completely different as we go forward than it ever was before, pre-pandemic, and now especially with this influx of new opportunities that are going to be coming, new job opportunities with the IIJA.
We've all heard about the Great Resignation. Have you done any work, and is there you have any sense of how that has affected infrastructure-related workforce?
Yeah, I think the Great Resignation is taking a step back, the impact to our whole U.S. workforce, and some interesting stats data to share with this group. So of the employers that we surveyed, 93% plan to hire this year, and that's 51% replacing or backfilling, but 41% hiring for new positions. And then the problem is, thanks to these fewer job seekers, good talent's getting harder to find. And what's really interesting, so candidates now being in the driver's seat with for job opportunities are looking for certain things. Top of their list, salary, equitable salary that we've heard our speakers address earlier today. They're looking for healthcare. They are looking for more flexible time. They're looking for benefits like childcare, and they're looking for additional time off. Overall, they're a little bit more in the driver's seat, and this is forcing employers to begin to change not just how they try to recruit and hire for candidates, but then these benefits that they're offering as well.
Okay.
Tom,
I was just going to ask you, Matt, to weigh in.
Yeah, and I think this is just such an important place to put a finer point on the definition of infrastructure. And when we look at workforce, so for counties, for example, as owners and operator of infrastructure, we need staff to maintain a lot of our infrastructure long term. But we need Ed Mortimer's members and the members of the American Road and Transportation Builders, the private sector, to often help us with the major construction projects, whether we're building a new jail. For example, the County of Los Angeles is looking to build a new jail for the last couple of years. That's a $3 billion project, right? So it's not the county workforce that's going to go build this new jail as major new infrastructure. It'll be the private sector. And so what we need is help with planning and design. We need the architects. We need folks thinking about equity in our communities. Where do we actually put our new facilities, whether they're bricks and mortar or more transit type systems with transportation and mobility. And so when we look at the workforce, I think we need to get a little bit more granular about where are we struggling. Is it on the architecture side where the private sector tends to be pretty strong? Is it in the construction side of what we're doing? The folks out there, the bulldozer operators, the road grade operators, the folks helping us pave the roads, doing the drywall, et cetera. And then on the maintenance side, do we have the internal capacity with our own county public works and maintenance staff to maintain this work? And so the answer is we need all of the above. And we're struggling across the country and across all of those topics that I just outlined. But on the positive side, we're seeing counties being really creative. We're seeing them really digging into their job descriptions, for example, and looking at what were the requirements that they had as far as did they require a bachelor's degree or more when they could have an associate's degree or a union skills certificate? How are they doing the job classifications? Because we're seeing that they're really trying to speed up the county hiring process from what previously probably took 3 months to 6 months to go through a job search and background checks and everything, to how can they do it in days so they can compete with the private sector. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that when we talk about infrastructure, I think it's really important to get a little more granular on what specific jobs are we talking about, from, again, architects and design to developing water systems. It's such a broad conversation.
As something of a representative of the private sector, I can say, and having done some hiring, I wish we could get it done in days ourselves. Marty, I wanted to ask you to just weigh in on this resignations issue and tell us a little bit more about, do you see that playing out in Missouri, and how do you address that?
We certainly do. Of course, every day I get, we leverage our friends at Burning Glass help us look at some data. Every day we know what online job postings we have, and we can track that, and we have 4-week moving averages and all kinds of great things. But the bottom line is this morning was over 150,000, active job postings in the state. We also can break that down by sector. And if we look at the sectors that we would maybe engage in this, whether it's, public sector employees or private sector employees that, will support construction or skilled trades or, the actual building of our roads and bridges, that's about a third of those open jobs. And we know the construction sector is really notorious for not posting their jobs online, right? Most of those are done by referral, or, you go onto a job site or you go to a union hall. So we're missing a ton of the construction jobs. So we know there's a big demand out there. And the idea is, how do we help increase labor force participation rates in Missouri, more citizens working so they can take advantage of these jobs? As far as the Great Resignation, I think it's happening for certain age groups. I mean, if you look at some of the data, there's been some really good reports of, okay, definitely over the age of 65, definitely over the age of 70. But our 45 to 65-year-olds are really having that shift, right? It's a mindset shift of, I want to do different work, or I want to work different hours, or maybe I want to be, an independent contractor, more entrepreneur. We're starting to see that play out, and it's beginning to kind of balance out in the market, right? We're getting back to structural unemployment and a less frictional unemployment, which is what I think we had as we recovered from the pandemic. So for us, making a match of what are people interested in doing and what skills do they need to be able to do it, as well as what the market needs, is kind of what we're trying to focus on, to be able to match those job openings with, available applicants.
I wanted to go back to you, Matt, for a second and turn to the subject of training. And do you see opportunities to integrate community colleges and certification programs into this whole process of workforce development?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's front and center. And what we are seeing are a lot of pilot programs that we're trying to scale up. I would say we're seeing partnerships between counties and community colleges, with unions, with nonprofit groups, for many examples here. And in 10 states, counties actually have some funding responsibility for community colleges. So we may be an actual funder or operator of the community college system. And what we're seeing our members focus on, particularly counties, because we're at the front lines of the social safety net. We deal with the criminal justice system. We're dealing with homeless. We're dealing with folks on other governmental assistance programs. What we're seeing is a huge effort, for example, in a county like Franklin County, which is Columbus, Ohio. They're working with TANF recipients of federal support programs and trying to match them up with the Columbus Urban League, with their construction trade groups, with the community colleges. They're finding folks who are typically on government service who want to get to work, they want to be productive, and they're trying to put them in a path with an apprenticeship or an associate's degree or a technical degree. We're seeing this across the country, both counties as employers, where we're trying to hire people for our own workforce, and where we're working with private employers, where we're trying to help them place folks into their jobs. So we're seeing a lot of innovation across the country with counties, community colleges, cities, the trade groups coming together, some of the Main Street chambers of commerce who have employers who have job openings. And if we can get them trained, they're guaranteed a job at the end of the day.
Marty, I wanted to ask you, just following up on that, in Missouri, are there efforts to integrate community colleges and other organizations into the training process?
Absolutely right. In fact, in Missouri, we have a strong tradition of our community colleges, being intimately involved. If we're looking at our apprenticeship programs, for instance, we are one of those DOL states. We love our DOL partners, and we don't necessarily, even though we're a big state in apprenticeships, we don't want to really run our own program because we understand the value in the Federal Registered Apprenticeship Framework. That means we have intermediaries that come to the table that help us deliver the related training and instruction necessary for those apprenticeship programs. Those are predominantly our community colleges. Our community colleges are the economic engines of our state, and we know that they're going to train tomorrow's workforce. We know they have the ability to understand the diverse populations that, across a big state like Missouri, we may not be able to understand being from one part of Missouri, understand what the needs of the employers are, to actually make a community level connection with those employers, to actually develop meaningful public-private partnerships where employers are at the table and looking at the populations they want to serve. So like Matt talks about, we're going to build a courthouse in a county. Well, those, if we can find people who can do the work from that population, knowing that we have to invest in them and skill them up, but we can do the work with these citizens that are there in that area, that's really meaningful. But it doesn't always work that way. Some of it's because of our bureaucratic red tape and how, how some of the process of hiring for these public projects are. But the other part of it is, I think, just, we need talent today and we don't have time to skill up that talent. So I guess my point there is if we can leverage community colleges and actually go into these communities where we're building the bridges, we're building the roads, we say, listen, you've got 300 people that aren't working right now. Let's put them on the job and let's train them while they're working. We'll mentor them. We'll put them through an apprenticeship program and they can stay home, do the work, build the bridge for their community and learn a craft. That, I think, that puts skin in the game from both the employers as well as the public sector as we're going to invest in that training or invest in that project.
I'd like to shift to apprenticeships, and since that's what you do for a living, John, tell us how your operation works and what specifically, in terms of IIJA, how are apprenticeships going to play a role?
Sure. So I think as we've all kind of mentioned before, right? I mean, a lot of the infrastructure projects are going to impact a lot of occupations that that traditionally utilize apprenticeship as the pathway into that occupation. So, we're really anticipating a major expansion of apprenticeship here over the next 5 years, and much of that will occur in a lot of traditional industries, whether it's, again, construction, roads, bridges, but also, transportation, the water improvement efforts that we've talked about. I mean, these are really going to impact a lot of very traditional apprenticeship programs, well established. So again, there's this opportunity to expand those programs, but also to improve equity across those programs. We were talking about community colleges before. That is an incredibly important partner that we utilize. Often they are the provider of the classroom instruction of apprenticeship, but we also see community colleges as potential sponsors of apprenticeship programs and what we're calling kind of apprenticeship hubs, right? intermediaries and catalysts that can help bring employers together and organize apprenticeship programs around specific industries. We're just wrapping up a project with the American Association of Community Colleges to really expand apprenticeship penetration and adoption with community colleges leading the way. The last thing I'll say here is, and we haven't talked about it already, is really the role of pre-apprenticeship. Pre-apprenticeship's kind of been the Wild West of workforce development. It hasn't always had a very clear definition. Just the use of the term pre-apprenticeship implies that it's a pathway to apprenticeship. But we know that that's not always the case, that there's a lot of pre-apprenticeship out there. Some's very good. I think others could be lacking. So, we're going to be looking at pre-apprenticeship as an important pathway into apprenticeship. But also trying to increase those pipelines. We've talked about these dual challenges of, needing to find more workers to fill these good jobs, but also to address the equity challenges. So we really do believe that well-designed pre-apprenticeship programs that have clear linkages to register apprenticeship is a way to really improve those pathways. And, again, apprenticeship by design is really intended to take someone that does not yet have that skills, background, or experience in that occupation, but they're ready to work. They're work ready, and move them through a structured process so that by the end of that program, they're fully proficient in that occupation. So, this is the original grow your own strategy. And, we really think it is key to a lot of the challenges around needing to build a deeper, broader pipeline of talent, but also to bring more and equitable groups into that talent pipeline. So really think that pre-apprenticeship will be a key part of that strategy.
Susan, I wanted to ask you, is Monster seeing any trends in its data and surveys related to apprenticeships and training?
Oh, absolutely. And, as John and Matt and our panel's been talking, particularly Marty, we a couple of interesting data points. So in our survey, over 50% of our workers felt that the pandemic made them realize they need more skills training. And of that, what's really interesting was a split around gender. 62% of men felt that they needed more skills training versus 51% of women. And I think when we're talking about registered apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeship, so many of the other programs that are out there, these are about workers that want to enhance their skills, to move into or expand, either shift their career or expand to a new career. But the other side of that too, which I think is encouraging for apprenticeship getting even a stronger hold across the US, 63% of US employers are willing to hire and train if that initial fit is right. And at that level, I mean, what Department of Labor has done nationally and helping out with the states to make it really easy for employers to identify apprenticeship programs that are going to help them find and train the workers for the skills to fit the jobs that they need. It's this wonderful cycle that we're seeing. And I think along this conversation too, around training and education and apprenticeships, one of the things that Matt was speaking, the incredible pressure and work ahead of all of our state and local workers to not only take in this funding, but allocate the grants, to hire workers, to attract workers. I think the work that Marty is doing in Missouri really speaks to the need to introduce automation and using technology, even among our processes that we're using to develop our workforces. And I think that'll allow greater input, for example, in matching job seekers, to assessments to help them really understand not just what good skills they have, but what's going to be a right fit for them. What's going to naturally play into their attributes, their passions, and where they want to take their careers. Technology can enable that and make it faster. You can use technology and innovation to better then align them into skills and training, match them to both state, local, national grant programs. So there's all of this tremendous, I think, there's some funding out there. We have really smart people at the state and local level working these issues. And let's not forget that technology can help make it go even faster.
Great. I want to turn to a subject that John raised and that other people have addressed and take this one head on, and that is the issue of equity. I'd like each of you to talk about the importance of social equity in the workforce development process, particularly now with IIJA and at this moment in the country's history. Matt, can you start us off?
Yeah, I can. And this issue is front and center for county governments, and I think for the whole country. So obviously, as we've talked about, we're in an incredibly tight labor market, and we still have a number of Americans who are underemployed. And unfortunately, one of the reasons we have people who are underemployed is because we over-incarcerate people, particularly minorities and people in disadvantaged communities. And what happens is once you're arrested and or convicted, it becomes very difficult to get a job, particularly in the construction industry where you may be operating heavy equipment. So we think we have to figure out, and our members are really pursuing solutions, including things like expunging criminal records for appropriate cases, particularly nonviolent people, to allow them to re-enter the labor market. One of the interesting things that happens is we have about 8 million individuals that cycle in and out of our county jails every year, for example. And often those folks don't have driver's licenses. Well, you're not going to find a job. You're not going to find housing. You're not going to find transportation without a driver's license, as an example, if your driver's license is suspended. And so this ties back into equity. And by no means am I saying every minority has been in the criminal justice system. But what I'm saying is we have 8 million Americans who cycle in and out of our county jails every year. And there is a huge section of people who could be work ready. What we're finding is some solutions tying back to the community college. We're seeing in Harlan County down in eastern Kentucky, down in the coal fields, where they've had an opioid epidemic for decades, really, that we're seeing the county work with the community college, the Center for Rural Development, on bringing more advanced machinery, computer-driven machinery training for that underserved workforce. To Leon County, which is Tallahassee, Florida. The county recently had several hundred vacancies, and they are doing the traditional posting online and some of the traditional, but what they decided was they needed to bring their job fairs into underserved neighborhoods. They literally found community facilities and used parking lots, used county libraries, and they went into parts of the community where folks maybe weren't going to apply online. Maybe they were jobs that had different skill sets that these folks didn't want to apply online, is what they heard. But they went to this in-person, old school kind of job fair, and they were able to fill these positions fairly quickly. But they were very intentional in going to underserved portions of their community, bringing the jobs to them, if you will. And so I think it's front and center, and we have to tackle it head on.
Great. Marty, how are you addressing these equity issues in Missouri?
Well, as Matt said, they certainly are front and center, and they have to be. Missouri is a population of about 6.2 million people. A number that I look at also every day, in addition to the active job postings, is what's our employment to population ratio look like, right? I mean, labor force participation gives us an idea of things. Certainly the U3 doesn't tell us anything. The U6 tells us a little bit more on the employment side. And as policymakers, we need to understand what those numbers mean. But I think if we can look at that, we can see, are we actually, is the relative share of our population actually engaged in work? And I think that helps us understand where are these barriers to access. Now, these barriers to access can be related to generational poverty. I mean, Missouri is a predominantly white population. However, we have a very high rate of white males, 25 to 45, who are not working, right? And who have not been educated or who have not been working. And so we understand that we need to look at that just as much as we need to look at some of our urban areas in St. Louis and Kansas City, and understanding why do we have some neighborhoods in St. Louis and Kansas City that maybe have double the unemployment rate of the average rate here in Missouri, across the state. And so it doesn't matter to us if it's rural, if it's urban, if it's a barrier related to generational poverty, whether it's self-efficacy. I don't believe I can do it. I don't believe I can change my trajectory, or this is how, I was raised, or this is where I come from, and I don't have economic mobility. We understand that we have to increase awareness of the options that are out there for everyone, and say, listen, we can create a pathway that's sustainable for everyone, and it's our job to help you do that. Now, one of the big things we look at is affordability to work. And, I think that if you try to not think about it politically, which is hard to do these days, you look at it and you can just say this. If someone starts losing some of the supports that are necessary to help them stabilize themselves or their family before they have enough earnings to actually do that, are we helping people stay in work, right? The number one reason people leave work is because they can't afford to work. If you come to take a job and you can't pay for the light bill because you didn't get your paycheck in time, or you had, or maybe you have liens filed against you, or maybe you owe back child support, maybe you finally got your driver's license, but now you can't, you can't get insurance on a vehicle. These are the things that keep people out of work. And so we're looking at those barriers just as much as we're looking at some of the other barriers that impact things, and understanding that, okay, it's great that wages are going up, but at $17 an hour, you might start losing some of your benefits as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to SNAP and TANF. And then what happens? If, how do you feed your children? How do you stabilize yourself while you're trying to build yourself and grow yourself out of poverty? So those are the things we try to think about. And we know that we have to look at it at the community level. We have to engage community resources, community partners. We work very closely, with our county and city governors, but also with, their ecumenical society, right? And with higher education, or with those community colleges, and whether it's housing, whether it's transportation, whether it's justice involved individuals, we got to get everybody at the table. We got to actually stop admiring the problem, start resolving the problem, right? By saying, this is the action that we'll take to support the whole worker or the whole citizen to be on a path for prosperity. Now, we've quantified that. We've put numbers of what we think that is based on cost of living and et cetera. We also know that it takes anywhere between 6 months and 4 years for someone to help themselves, grow themselves, quote, out of poverty. You cannot do that on your own. You have to have a public system that can support you to do that, and a system that's fair, a system that incentivizes performance and growth, but also that, again, that is fair and easily accessible for all.
I'm going to save John for last because I think he's really going to be able to bring us home on this issue, and ask Susan, what's your perspective on the equity issue?
Sure. I think fair compensation is something that we know is really important to workers. I don't know that I can, add more to what Marty and Matt have spoken to, and what I know John's going to bring us home to. But an important aspect of this as well is really a message for our employers. And this gets to the importance of transparency. And one of the, in our survey, we asked job seekers, and nearly a quarter were skeptical of the promises made in a job ad. What does that say about our employers and that trust, right, that we have with our workers? And not great, but I think that that's where we're also going to see increased importance on employers developing their brand, because it isn't just the work opportunity, but it's that employee, that candidate that's going to be joining a larger organization. And what are the values that that organization stands for? Will there be fair and equitable compensation? Is there transparency around that? Will they see job progression? Is the employer going to continue to invest in their skills development and their career growth? All of that gets into the employer's brand and what they're conveying to the worker, which isn't just that immediate job, but where's their opportunity to join and grow and potentially stay. And I think that a large component of that as well is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and employers' commitment to that, and not just, words on a website, but what are the programs that they're involved with? What are the specific things that they're doing to support their workers, to support their community? And all of that is going to factor into someone's decision to join one employer over another when they've got the choice.
So, John, tell us more about what the opportunity is here, and at the risk of asking you to speak for the entire federal government, what the federal government's expectation is in terms of what can be achieved on the equity front.
Sure. I mean, no pressure, right? But I think the expectations are incredibly high, and I think the bar has been set very clearly that this is the opportunity to address these inequities. We've talked a lot about apprenticeship and its potential to create pathways to these good jobs, but let's actually look at the data today, right? Says only about 13 or 14% of all apprentices are women. When you look at the construction industry, it's probably around 5%. African Americans are underrepresented. And when you dice the data and look at it more closely in where many of these infrastructure projects will be located, and you compare the participation rates in the apprenticeship programs in those communities, that gap grows. So tremendous opportunity, but if we don't look at this structurally, we're not going to improve equity. We're going to exacerbate it, right? We're going to not provide these pathways to good jobs if we're not very conscious about the current challenges that exist. And the opportunity is pretty unlimited here, right? When we're starting at this point where we only have 5% of women in construction jobs, how we can obviously do much better. But it will take more than just thinking about access to the jobs. I think Marty and others talked about it. How do we ensure persistence in those opportunities? How do we make sure that more people complete, that they're not occupationally segregated, that they're getting the same opportunities on the job as others? So, we've talked a lot about pre-apprenticeship as an important strategy, but supportive services, really comprehensive supportive services. I think, again, Marty may have touched on this. There are things that force people to drop out of programs because of transportation, childcare, other issues. What can states and locals do? There's lots of funding out there. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about funding, but we have really advocated for states and localities to utilize that funding to provide comprehensive supportive services in these programs, mentorship. There's a whole range of things that really need to be looked at, but we've set a goal that we want apprenticeship programs to reflect the communities in which they operate, and that is our goal, and that's what we're driving to.
I'm glad you mentioned funding, because I wanted to turn to that next and ask you what are the funding opportunities available, and are they enough right now to make a difference?
Sure. Well, timing's everything here, because we did just announce a new round of funding yesterday. But first, I would say that there is already significant resources available to states right now around apprenticeship. Just last June, we announced almost $100 million to states as part of our state apprenticeship expansion, equity, and innovation grants. Many of those states are just starting to implement those efforts, and we're really encouraging states to consider how they can use those funds to support infrastructure implementation. So there is funding out there now, but just yesterday, Secretary Walsh announced another $113 million that will be made available and will be awarded prior to June 30th. There's 4 categories of funding under this new funding opportunity. There's one category for states, a state grant bucket. There's another around equity and pre-apprenticeship that we've talked about. Another area that we haven't talked as much about, but youth apprenticeship grants. We see tremendous potential and opportunity for youth apprenticeship, particularly apprenticeship programs that start while students are still in high school and can articulate right through to that community college participation as well. And then the last bucket, which is a little bit new this year, is this idea of apprenticeship hubs, which I've touched a little bit on earlier. But there really isn't a local apprenticeship system. There's a state apprenticeship system, a federal apprenticeship system, but there's not really a local apprenticeship system. And this is trying to fill that gap a little bit to think about how localities, but also community colleges, the workforce system, local industry associations can really be that hub and that nucleus to stand up new apprenticeship programs or expand on existing ones. So we're really excited about this funding opportunity. And folks can go to apprenticeship.gov to learn more. But that's 2 rounds of funding that are going to go out here within the last year.
Matt, I feel like maybe you're not going to tell me you have all the money you need and everything's fine. So what is the current situation relative to funding?
Well, it's not about just funding. And I think Marty outlined it well before. I think having conversations like this where we're focused on having the right mindset and getting folks really focused on how do you harness relationships, how do you look at the data and look at where people are truly underserved, and how do you create the right incentives for people to work together? We always, unfortunately, joke that in the private sector, you celebrate innovation, in the public sector, you investigate it. Every time the public sector tries to do something new, we send the inspector general after them. And so we really need to change the mindset and the incentives. And what we're seeing is counties are really trying to inspire, particularly our youth, to enter public service through like youth academies. Youth academies don't cost a lot of money to invite kids into the county government, let them see what these jobs of the future are. And then going back to the incentives, I look at Marty's boss, the governor of Missouri, who has been, I believe, calling for raising minimum wage, for example. No one would say he's a liberal Democrat. He is pretty conservative Republican. And when I bring that up is there's now political signals and political incentives for all elected officials to engage in the workforce discussion because the private sector, the public sector, nonprofits don't have enough workers. And so I think we got to focus on the mindset and creating the right incentives for creativity and the right outcomes. We got to focus on the outcomes. And that goes back to the equity conversation, is those that have opportunities, particularly to go to college and others, they're not lacking opportunity. We don't have to really do too much more on that side, maybe lower student loan rates or something. But for those that don't even have an opportunity, we need to figure out how to provide incentives to give those folks hope and opportunity. So that's with our youth. We have a lot we can do with our veterans, who this country invests a ton of money in their training and skills, and yet those skills don't often crosswalk into state and local government job classifications. And I know there's been a lot of work in that arena. We've got a lot of folks, as I mentioned earlier, in the justice involved. How can we make it easier, particularly if they're nonviolent? How do we transition them to the workforce? And then, we just have a lot of work to do. But these are great conversations to get us going.
I'm interested in that piece about relationships and incentives. Marty, can you tell us what you're doing in terms of developing relationships with localities and other partners to make this process work?
Absolutely. So we love the 50-50 match model, right? So what we've been able to do with the ARPA money, what we think we're going to be able to do with some of the bipartisan infrastructure dollars, these investments that we're going through our appropriations process with, through the governor's budget and through our General Assembly, these dollars will then pass through to these local communities. Now, obviously, this is not the money that they're being direct funded, the money that goes straight through from the federal government, but the dollars that we have, we're putting another 50% on the table. We're saying we want you to put 50% on the table at the same time. Let's match these projects. So if it's a big highway project and it's a big deal for some of our counties, again, to build a slab bridge that's like an eighth of a, or 800th of a mile might cost, up to upwards of $250,000. That's a big deal for a small county. What we want to be able to do is say, listen, we'll pay for half of it, or we can pay, we can skill up the talent that you might need to do that. We'll put some skin in the game, but you got to put some skin in the game too. So I think that's one way to do it. But I want to be very clear. It's one of those situations with the funding. The funding situation is that workforce developers will tell you it's water everywhere and not a drop to drink. And the reason we'll say that is not because we want bigger government or because we want more money. It's because the dollars that are going through these projects is very vital. But we forgot to do the most important thing through CARES Act, through ARPA, and through the bipartisan infrastructure plan. And because Build Back Better is probably dead, we're not going to get the job training money we need to make sure we have the workforce and the skilled talent that we need to be able to do that. So, we look at WIOA, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, or Wagner-Pfizer, or Jobs and Veteran State Grant programs, right? Our traditional programs. Well, that congressional pie gets smaller every year. And there's this hold harmless clause where states and then local areas get, the max that you could be cut is 10%. But the next year it's based on the cut from the previous year. Well, we've been receiving those 10% cuts. And in Missouri alone, we've lost about $17 million across states since 2014. That makes it very hard to invest in serving individuals, training individuals, and making those matches. So we need some more support, and we need to understand that if we're going to spend $250,000 to build a bridge, we need to also spend a third of that to identify talent, to skill that talent up, and who's going to do it, right? I mean, who can afford to do it? And I think that's the big piece, and that's why we have challenges. Now, I will say we love the our apprenticeship expansion in Missouri. We've been successful since 2017. We pulled down about $16 million from the programs that John's talked about. And we put that money straight out, into our communities and support the intermediary network. That works. But again, there has to be enough of it to really make impact, and it has to be sustainable. And unfortunately, we don't have a sustainable framework anywhere in the country right now for workforce development funding. And that is something that as we do these projects, we're going to have a gap.
So I'm glad we're clear that John's not to blame. How do you, Marty, how do you work around that funding issue?
So we do everything we can. We look at how do you integrate and braid and weave funds, right? So we're looking at, how do we leverage SNAP? How do we leverage TANF funds, right? And there are a lot of opportunities there. How do we leverage our WIOA funds? And so, funding a project now, and that's no different than if you're trying to figure out how to build a courthouse, right? You might have some bonding, you might have, local tax revenue that supports those bonds. You might have some, donations, things like this. Well, it's the same thing when we structure workforce development deals. We have to understand that, some of the money is going to come from a different, a suite of federal programs. But then also we're going to have to pull some money out of our community colleges to be able to pay for this. We're going to pull some money, out of the Missouri Department of Transportation. We might have to pay, those individuals who are the engineers a little bit less because we need to be able to spend more money to train individuals who are going to actually come in and maintain those highways. So we have to make decisions. We have to braid funds, and so we end up doing not as much as we want to do, but we do the best we can. Now, I will say again, these federal competitive grants have been extremely helpful. I love the flexibility. I love the flexibility that we've been afforded under Wagner-Pfizer in recent years, and I would hate to see that go away. And I think there's 34 states that are willing to sign on and say that. We love the flexibility that we have with how to use some of the apprenticeship dollars, and we love the flexibility that the Secretary of Transportation is going to have in the infrastructure bill. But it has to be one that is equitable for all states to access, and so it can't be that we're picking winners and losers and who can have flexibility and who can't have flexibility. Because with limited funding, you definitely have to maximize flexibility.
Susan, I wanted to turn to you and shift to, we've talked about resignations, and what are you seeing in terms of barriers and trends related to individuals' reluctance to rejoin the workforce?
Sure. I'm not sure that we would characterize a reluctance to rejoin the workforce. I think that we've been talking about some of the challenges, and Marty and Matt in particular, that are facing workers. It's not always just about the job, but what are the resources, the transportation for an individual to get to the job, for childcare. But what's interesting, Marty was just talking about how important it is for our states and localities to have flexibility in how they're using and applying funds to meet the specific needs of their community. That's really a similar theme to what we continue to hear and see on job seekers, is that need for flexibility. Compensation is always going to be a top concern, but flexibility is increasingly driving those choices. Now, it's really interesting. We talk about work that is remote work. Many of us have shifted to that kind of mode, but when we're talking about many infrastructure jobs, that's not necessarily going to be an option to remote work. Just to, perhaps tag for a future conversation, we've seen and may see potential other challenges in sometimes managers are afforded more remote work opportunities, but yet, workers literally boots on the ground don't necessarily have that option. And that's creating an inequity that I think we may really need to be more creative in how we're addressing. But in terms of that flexibility, it may not be flexibility to work from home for a particular job, but it could be flexibility around schedules for those working parents that maybe need to have an early or late after, school drop off, having the flexibility for their hours and when they, arrive or leave can really make a difference in them being able to take care of their family and succeed in the workplace and not be penalized for that. I think we've seen the leisure and hospitality industry start to move a lot in this direction over the last several months, particularly with the worker shortage. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how we can begin to apply that to infrastructure jobs.
Hey, Tom, on that, just real quick, I think there's two sides to this at least. On the plus side for the workers, because there is a shortage, workers who, particularly those that are mobile, are actually benefiting. They're getting higher wages, particularly in the construction industry. They can move around and they can go relocate and work on a job, maybe commute back and forth on weekends, but they're often crossing across their state or even across state boundaries. I know I was talking to Marty's colleague, Director McKenna, who's an exceptional state DOT director, one of the most thoughtful individuals. The state's struggling to keep some of their engineers and others. And I said, the private sector's stealing them away. And he said, no, the cities pay better. And so they're actually bouncing between counties, cities, state, and then sometimes the private sector. So on the one hand, there's some positive upside for the workers, particularly those that are more skilled. They can actually make higher wages. And then going back to what Marty was saying about the affordability to work, I think childcare remains one of the biggest barriers for reentry to work. Also, with the aging baby boomers, more and more workers are now taking care of their parents, not just their kids. And we really need to think about a 3-generation approach to how we care for our families and our workers. And then finally, the transportation issue. We're finding some counties partnering with Lyft or Uber, for example, particularly Lyft in a couple of counties, to help those that lost access to public transportation during the pandemic. It's not that public transportation wasn't available. It's because of the nature of the virus. People didn't want to take public transportation. And how could we actually get people to work? So there's some barriers to getting people back to work, that affordability to work. I would add the childcare, transportation. And then secondly, remember there is an upside for some of these workers who are competitive to get better wages.
We've gotten a bunch of questions from participants in the audience, and I'd like to get to at least a couple of those in the time we have left. One is, what is being done to build the capacity of government at all levels to administer this massive effort? There are bound to be all sorts of challenges getting the funding out and ensuring that the funds are used appropriately. Marty, maybe you can tell us from the state level perspective.
It's really tough. You know, the number one government role or government function or skill set, if you will, competency, there's the word, that we're looking for is project management, right? Managing these complex projects, because we're talking about millions of dollars. We're talking about multi-year projects, and we're talking about having to manage and wrangle a bunch of different partners together because of the braided funding. And often our counties or our cities may not have or certainly our state agencies don't have the right, have individuals who have that kind of skill set, right? They know they're specialized, they know their program, they know their job really well, but they don't know how to manage these big, huge, complex projects. So I think that's, one of the things. If we think about building up capacity, we have to think about, okay, one, yes, we need more people. And yes, we are losing people. I mean, we can't keep state troopers because we're losing them to their, our counties and our cities because their law enforcement pays more. But in addition to that, we need to, expand the capacity and basically the knowledge base and understand we need to pivot because our job as government now is different. One thing we forget to think about with all these dollars that come down, I'm sure Matt knows it very well. He doesn't forget to think about it, but is all of the monitoring, the reporting, the compliance that we have to deal with. And it's a lot, right? And these are teams of people now that you have to have on staff to make sure that you're in compliance. So nobody, inadvertently, nobody wants to do wrong. Yeah, there's bad actors out there, but nobody wants to misuse the funds. But I can tell you, everybody's scared to death of misusing the funds and not, uploading the right document at the right time and then having a disallowed cost, which in government world means I have to pay that back with other money, means my local money, and I have to tell a taxpayer that I made a mistake. That's a big problem. So, we talk about, yes, we need people with skill sets to operate the plows, to work in our law enforcement, but we also need on the administration side to really focus on individuals with digital skills, digital competency, digital literacy, understanding technology, but also understanding project management and relationships, because that right now is the biggest part of what we're doing.
Here's another question that I think is in John's area. With the DOL's apprenticeship hubs, excuse me, are there any opportunities to engage with localities, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, and private organizations to help connect individuals to meaningful work?
So the short answer is yes, and I'm going to have to punt on a longer answer because this is an open FOA. So again, I would refer people to that funding opportunity to get more information about who the eligible entities are. I mentioned 4 categories. There's different eligible entities and required partners and suggested partners for each of those different categories. But again, because it is an open FOA, I do have to be limited in terms of how much more I can say on that.
Fair enough.
Hey, Tom, would it be possible to go back to that previous question about how you manage the funding? And, I just want to make sure the audience has a deep dive on this for a second. Is one, we had the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, and now this major federal infrastructure bill. The American Rescue Plan, particularly the money that flowed to state and local governments through the U.S. Treasury, about $350 billion, we'll probably see just as much infrastructure, especially in the next 24 months, funded through the American Rescue Plan. And in the county's case, we got about $65.1 billion in direct funding. A huge portion of that is going to go to infrastructure, water and sewer, stormwater, facility retrofits like our courthouses, our jails and other things, our hospitals, schools. When we talk about the new infrastructure bill, I think people see the $1 trillion and they forget that half of that is existing programs where they got reauthorized for the next 5 years, and about half of it is new money. And then when you break it down, some of that money is flowing through traditional formula programs, particularly on the surface transportation side. So state DOTs certainly need to ramp up, but they are entities that have experience. Airport authorities, transit systems, state DOTs, some cities and counties, but primarily state DOTs and metropolitan planning organizations. When you get to the other half of the money that's new, and there's going to be a lot more federal competitive programs where state and locals and tribes and territories are applying to the federal government, that's where we're going to get into some trickiness that Marty mentioned, learning new programs that will have brand new regulations. These programs don't exist. the federal departments have to come up with brand new rules and regulations, new grant portals. That really is time consuming and cumbersome. We know why they did it through Congress. That's kind of the way the reconciliation process works, and they were kind of forced to do it that way. But on the traditional programs, I think state and locals will be able to handle it a little more easily. It's not going to be simple, but we know what we're doing there on traditional programs. It's these new programs are going to take more time. It's going to take a lot more resource. And then lastly, we're seeing some great new partnerships between state and local governments working together on, as Marty said, match incentives, states helping the state auditor or controller, helping the counties prepare, doing training. Unfortunately, about 20% of our counties face a disaster every year that rises to the level of a FEMA declaration. And so I don't mean to be critical, but if you can survive FEMA's paperwork, you can probably survive anybody's. And unfortunately, we're getting a lot of practice there. But we're seeing some great partnerships too with university systems like schools of public administration. We're seeing our state associations build capacity. And then we're seeing a lot of private sector companies obviously step up and help us with that compliance.
Great. Well, I think we could go on and on these subjects, but we're at the end of our allotted time. I want to just take a second to thank the panel for your terrific insights, and thank the audience for joining us today and for submitting such great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. But I think we've all learned a lot today, and I thank our panelists and speakers for that, and I'll turn it back to Terry.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for moderating such a great conversation. And I want to thank all of our panelists for your really insightful comments and the focus that you gave us on beginning to develop real solutions to this complicated issue. For all of our folks who registered, we'll be posting this video and we'll be sharing the link with you. And I want to encourage all of you to check out the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships on our NAPA website at napawash.org. Thanks so much for joining us today.